So, just in light of what's been going on in our nation, our country, I felt that it was important that we tackle the subject of racism and race, just as we're seeing these events unfolding in our nation more and more that appear to be race related. And so how are we to respond as Franciscans, as Catholics, as Christians? But I want and need to be, honest and upfront. First off, that I am a white middle class person who was raised in about a 99.9% white community in New England. I do acknowledge that I have benefited from the privilege of being a white European American. And it's not enough for me anymore to say, oh, I have Black and biracial friends and family, or that I have attended rallies in the South to stand up against racism. It may bring me closer to being an ally, but I do not have the generational experiences to really know the pain and the hurt and the discrimination that has taken place over generations. So I just want to clarify that up first. But recently in the last week, we have witnessed the guilty verdict of the white police officer, Derek Chauvin, in the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah.
We have seen a rise in violence against Asian Americans, which moved the Senate to pass an Asian American hate crime bill aimed at addressing the surge in attacks on Asian Americans amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Between 2015 and 2019, anti-Semitic incidents have jumped to record high numbers, and so on and so forth. But we cannot let these just become another headline that doesn't affect us both emotionally and spiritually. So today I'm going to use two sources, both an article from the Tao USA Fall 2020 magazine, and also a USCCB pastoral letter on racism to help us inform ourselves. And then we'll move into our rule of life as secular Franciscans to help us shape our response. So if you have your Tao, you might grab it. I don't know how close that is to you, but if you receive it. And so also, the USCCB has issued a few statements and letters on the subject of racism over the years. In 1958, we had discrimination in Christian conscience. 63, we had one titled on racial harmony. In 1979, brothers and sisters to us. And then the most recent one, which I'll use today, is called Open Wide Our Hearts. And again, that's what we'll use today as a starting point. So again, like if you have your Tao magazine close by, you might grab it, as well as your rule book, if you have that close by, and also maybe a pen and paper to jot down some notes for use in our small groups when we get there. So first of all, oops, I gotta do my thing. So first of all, what is racism? So I'll read it here. Racism exists when either consciously or unconsciously, a person holds that his or her own race is superior and therefore judges persons of other races or ethnicities as inferior or unworthy of equal regard. So when this conviction or attitude leads individuals or groups to exclude, ridicule, mistreat, or unjustly discriminate against a person on the basis of their race or ethnicity, it is sinful. And racist acts are sinful because they violate justice and fail to acknowledge the human dignity of the persons offended and equally made in the image of God. So racism can be found in the hearts, and in many cases it's placed there unwillingly or unknowingly by our upbringing or culture. It can lead to thoughts and actions that we do not even see as racist, but nonetheless flow from a prejudice root that, again, we may not even be aware of. Another point I want to make first off, as we start off this day, is that, of course, we're seeing more and more headlines that report the killing of many times unarmed African Americans by law enforcement officials. Interactions with police are often fraught with fear and even danger for both parties involved. But it's noteworthy that in our prisons, the number of inmates of color, mostly those brown or black, is grossly disproportionate. So you can see here the statistics. Blacks make up 33% of the prison population and are only 12% of the US adult population. Whites, 63% of the US adult population, yet only 30% of the prison population. And again, lastly, Hispanics, 16% and 23% of prison populations. So you can see the disparity there that goes on in our US justice system. We've also seen years of systemic racism in how resources are allocated to communities that remain really, in essence, segregated. One familiar example is the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, which resulted from policy decisions that negatively affected the inhabitants, the majority of who are African Americans. From the Flint, Michigan Water Crisis Commission report, it says, preceding the flurry of state of emergency activity, Flint residents had been reporting heavily discolored and bad tasting water for well over a year. You can read that report if you're interested in the michigan.gov website. But we know well the impact of elevated lead levels on the brain development and learning disabilities in children. So you can see here right off the bat that these African American children in Flint, Michigan are starting their lives at a disadvantage. This is systemic racism. Would this have happened in a predominantly white upper class community? The commission report ascertained that no, it probably would not have happened. So yes, with changes that we've seen in our lifetime from the civil rights movement and related legislations, and there have been some, let me get that off. We may believe that racism is no longer an affliction of our society or only found in the hearts of people who can be dismissed as ignorant, but it still very much affects our culture and it has no place in the Christian heart. People are still being harmed. So action is needed to bring about genuine conversion of hearts. All of us need personal conversion, and our church and civic institutions are also in need of ongoing reform. So here on this slide, I just wanted to illustrate, the journey of where our Native American community has come. And we were blessed to see the first Native American cabinet secretary sworn in this year from our neighboring New Mexico, Laguna Pueblo. So many groups can attest to having been the target of racial and ethnic prejudice in this country over the years. The Irish, Italians, Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, Polish, Jewish, Chinese, Japanese, it really goes on and on. But many groups are still experiencing prejudice. Again, I mentioned the rising anti-Semitism, discrimination of Hispanics, anti-Muslim sentiment, and experience of Native American and African American citizens. And today, sadly, we are seeing a rise in hate crime against Asian Americans, directly related to those in power using their voice to influence and incite violence. I want to share a quick video with you from the Stop Asian Hate rally just held last week in Austin, Texas. So to do that, I think I need to stop share, and then I'm going to share again, and I'm going to share a different screen. So bear with me once again, please. And I hope that you can hear it. I'll turn it up as loud as I can get it. Oh, wrong one. Sorry about that. We'll do that one at the end. Oh. Sorry, I got too many papers here in front of me and I can't reach my thing.
Anymore. The Pan-Asian community is growing here in Austin. The events on the news has shown that anti-Asian violence has increased, and it's really important for us to come out and show that we exist and really support each other.
I think there's a general ignorance in terms of what we do have to deal with in microaggressions every day, and there's just kind of a general ignorance of how that affects us every day.
I think what most Asian Americans and Asians are experiencing right now in Austin, a lot of it's microaggression. A lot of it is, either verbal or, in conversations, especially when we're out in public. There's a sense that for Asian American, we don't feel safe in showing ourselves in public because of what's been happening with the pandemic, with the coronavirus, and how that's been construed to be something that's connected with just being Chinese, being Asian.
Obviously, there's racism, whether it's blatant or if there's an undercurrent of racism. I think fetishization is also something that hits the Asian American community more so, and also what we call the model minority myth. Asian Americans, we keep our head down, we go to school, we work hard, we populate the tech industry, we never complain. And when things happen, we follow the rules and we go along with things. And I think it's time for us to really start speaking up and coming together and to stand up against the rising tide of racism that's hitting our community.
So there's a lot of fear from our Asian community in knowing how people will react to us, especially when we're in public. There's a sense that what has been the undercurrent has finally come to the surface. I know for myself, I've done most of my work in my life just assimilating, trying to blend in, trying to keep my head down and not stir any trouble, not stand out. And unfortunately, what's come from this pandemic and the coronavirus has brought my Asian appearance, my Chinese culture to the forefront. And a lot of us don't feel safe.
We are all fierce to going out in case we face the confrontation.
Stand up for us, stand up with us, extend a hand out to us, reach out to ask us what's meaningful and what needs to be done.
So again, stand up with us, stand up for us. And I just want to stress again, that's just from last week. That's nothing, that's in our past, nothing that we have come through. This is a very recent issue that our Asian American community is facing. And again, so we are all called to listen and to know the stories of our brothers and sisters. We have to create these opportunities to hear with open hearts the tragic stories that are deeply imprinted on the lives of our brothers and sisters through the generations. They don't just go away. These are part of their family, part of their background, part of their roots. I want to go over just a few other specific experiences. Starting off first with the Native American experience. So of course, this land had many diverse peoples and customs, languages, beliefs, long before Europeans arrived. Colonialism has left deep wounds that remain unhealed and impact the generations of today. St. John Paul II, in his 1987 trip to Arizona, addressed the native peoples of the Americas and acknowledged the significance and profound negative impact of the encounter with Europeans. He said, they, the Europeans, were blind to the dignity of the indigenous people, leaving them with lasting scars of the violence impacted on them and their ways of life. So here we can recall, events, the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee people experienced, and the Long Walk of the Navajos, both in an attempt to Americanize them, stripping them from generations of customs and language. And really, any good done by missionaries that we're familiar with were overshadowed by the devastation of expansion policy. The effects of this evil are still seen today in the difficulties experienced by Native Americans with poverty, unemployment, dispute over land, exploitation of natural resources, and just to name a few. The African American experience. As we know, Africans were bought and sold as mere property, often beaten, raped, and literally worked to death. A racial classification system was established, including an identification of some as subhuman, which was used to justify this slavery. The injustices of slavery were horrifying and lasted for generations. Families separated, marriages were forbidden, children were mistreated and forced to work. Even after the end of legal slavery, many former slaves still faced continued servitude and encountered new forms of resentment and violence. Even in freedom, many Blacks still lived in fear for their lives. Many still do live in fear for their lives. Most lived in extreme poverty and endured daily indignities in their interactions with whites. The right to participate in civil society, such as the political process, was withheld or severely hindered for another whole century. African Americans have been labeled as inferior by individuals, society, and even the church for a period of time. One example of that is servant of God, August Tolton, who was born into slavery and escaped to the free state of Illinois. But he was rejected by all seminaries in the USA, even though he felt a strong call to the priesthood. Eventually, he made it to a seminary in Rome and was ordained and returned as the first Black priest born in the USA. And again, faced much discrimination and racism, including by a brother priest who was white and encouraged other people not to go to Father Tolton's parish. So to understand how racism works today, we have to recognize that generations were disadvantaged by slavery, wage theft, Jim Crow laws, and the denial of access to wealth, building opportunities, leaving many without hope and feeling unloved. True that some individuals have thrived. However, significant numbers are still born into economic and social disparity, including the lack of affordable housing, meaningful work, adequate education, just to name a few. And just FYI, and you guys probably know this, but the Jim Crow laws, were those state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. It was named after a Black minstrel show character. But the laws, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era up until about 1968, were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, and other opportunities. And even those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fined, jail sentences, violence, and death. I feel I would be remiss not to mention the forms of prejudice and oppression experienced by Hispanics in our country. Since the Mexican-American War, Hispanics from several countries have experienced discrimination in housing, employment opportunities, healthcare, and education. They've been referred to by derogatory names, encountered negative assumptions made about them, and suffered discrimination applying for housing, college, registering to vote, etc. Even for those kids who have been raised in this country, and this is their home. Despite the numerous contributions to the US economy, there's a large income gap between Hispanic and European Americans. Hispanics are a target of immigration raids and mass deportations. And today, many are simply assumed to be here illegally. This is an attitude of superiority and has no place in the life of any follower of Christ. And many of these families were in this country long before these borders have changed. So you can see here on this slide how the borders had changed since the Mexican-American War. So what are we to do and how are we to behave? We can first look to the prophet Micah. You have been told, O mortal, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk humbly with your God. So to do justice means honest acknowledgement of our failures and the restoration of right relationship. And actually, this is the original meaning of justice, where we are in right relationship with God, with one another, and with the rest of God's creation. And to love goodness means pursuing what leads to peace and to the building up of one another. As Christians, we know very well that it is our duty to love others. I mean, we live by this greatest commandment of Jesus. And we live by the Spirit, whose fruits are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. We know these. We can all take a moment to examine our own conscience and ask ourselves seriously if these fruits are alive in our attitude about race. Or does our attitude reflect the opposite? Mistrust, impatience, anger, distress, discomfort, etc., etc. Okay, so with all this, what is a secular Franciscan to do? We live our rule. We don't just read it or carry around our little book in our pocket or our backpacks. We live it day to day. We put it into our practice. So here you can see from the prologue of our rule, you know, those who love others produce worthy fruits of penance, of conversion, and how happy and blessed we will be. So I want to get back to the document, Open Wide Our Hearts, the bishop's pastoral letter, because there are pieces in there that we can directly relate to our rule. Love compels each of us to resist racism courageously. That word courageously should jump out to you from our rule. From Article 15, let us individually and collectively be in the forefront of promoting justice by the testimony of our lives and our courageous initiatives. So, because really, you know, evangelization means not only preaching, but courageously witnessing conversion and renewal and the building up of community. We're all called to courageously evangelize with our lives. To assist in the conversion needed in those who are still harboring racism. So we can look to Article 7. united by our vocation as brothers and sisters of penance and motivated by the gospel, we conform our thoughts and deeds to those of Jesus by that radical interior change that we know of as conversion. And as secular Franciscans, we know that conversion is a big part of our life. Examining our sinfulness is a very humbling experience, and it requires that we acknowledge our sinful deeds and ask forgiveness. Again, back to Article 7, on the road to renewal, on the road to conversion, the sacrament of reconciliation is a privileged sign of the Father's mercy and our source of grace. Because, you know, even like not too long ago in our history, many Catholic parishes had people of color segregated in their seating and were even required to receive Eucharist after the white parishioners. I mean, those are things I think that as a church, as a community, we need to acknowledge those sinful behaviors in the way that we were treating others. Maintain an ongoing encounter with Jesus, which we know we do through the gospel, and seek to combat racism with love. Article 4, probably one of our most well-known articles, I think. Observe the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ by following the example of St. Francis of Assisi, who made Christ the inspiration and center of his life. We go from gospel to life and life to gospel. To work at ending racism, we need to engage the world and encounter others, to see those on the peripheries. And again, back to Article 5. Therefore, we should seek to encounter the living and active person of Christ in all of our brothers and sisters. We must invite into dialogue those we ordinarily would not seek out. We must work to form relationships by going beyond ourselves. Article 19 points to this, that mindful that we are bearers of peace, which must be built up unceasingly. We should seek out ways of unity and fraternal harmony through dialogue. We use that word dialogue quite a lot because it is so important. I think I lost my place. Hold on one sec. Taking concrete action includes advocating for equality in how laws are implemented. Article 15 of our rule, let us individually and collectively be in the forefront of promoting justice, especially in the field of public life. We should make definite choices in harmony with our faith. One of the easiest ways that comes right to us is through the ballot, through the voting. Another way to fight racism is by educating ourselves. And then we use that education to make change, like in the voting, with our ballot. And another way also is to form the consciences of the younger generations. You know, break the silence around the issue of racism or other hard conversations to have with children. Well, last week, Joan Nordstrom shared a beautiful story of a conversation that she had with her granddaughter on homelessness. And I think these times that we can do that are going to be very important to shaping our future. Pope Francis, in his visit to Congress in 2015, said, the effects of unjust structures and actions are all too apparent. Our efforts must aim at restoring hope, righting wrongs, maintaining commitment, and thus promoting the well-being of individuals and peoples. The injustice and harm racism causes are attacks on human life. You know, the USCCB very strongly speaks out against abortion, assisted suicide, euthanasia, the death penalty. All of these severely affect people of color who are disproportionately affected by poverty, targeted for abortion, have less access to health care, have the greatest numbers on death row, and are most likely to feel pressure to end their lives when facing serious illness. I cannot stress enough that racism is a pro-life issue. So this graphic that we have on the screen right now is from the article in the Tao magazine, and you may be familiar with it from other things that you've attended as well. But I want to take a few minutes to look at this graphic. And if you have your Tao magazine, you may want to pull it out. It's on page 11. But you can really see how this graphic reflects the conversion needed in our approach to racism and to becoming anti-racist. You know, where are we at now? Where do we need to keep growing? So I want to, again, take a few minutes, ask ourselves where we are in this circle. Are we in the fear zone where we're kind of avoiding these questions? We're denying it's a problem. We're staying in our comfortable bubbles. You know, have we moved into the learning zone? We're recognizing it is the present and current problem. We're understanding our own privilege. Are we educating ourselves about structural racism? Or have we moved a little bit into the growth zone? You know, are we okay to sit in our discomfort? Do we speak out when we see racism in action? Do we surround ourselves with others who think and act differently than we do? So again, maybe if you have your pen and paper, just jot down a few notes on this, because this is where I want to lead us into our small group discussions. And hopefully, you know, in our small groups, you know, it's a safe, it's a confidential place to speak. It's okay to be ourselves. It's okay to be vulnerable, and recognize where we need to grow. And as community and as fraternity, that's what we're here to do with each other, is to journey together. So, so again, if you have your Tao, it's on page 11, or you can just make some notes off of this graphic. And then I will have Amy break us up into groups again. And then when we come back, I'll show you that other video that I accidentally pressed first. So Amy, if you
Click here.
There, okay,
There
I
it
got
is.
it.
I've been walking, my face turning to weight on the shoulder, pulling in my well, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have to run. Do what I can when I can, while I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's why I will stand up. Take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gotta keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my bones, and I know what's around the bend. hard faces I'm alone, and I just might fail, but Lord knows I tried. Shooting stars fill up the sky. Take my people with me, together we are going to a brand new home. Far across the river, you hear freedom calling me to answer. Keep on keeping on, healing in my heart.